Hello guys, welcome to the Parson series, and today we will be continuing our chapter number 8. We had seen the beautiful concepts of perimetry. Today we will be starting with our dark adaptation. Ocular sensitivity can be determined by measuring the least luminance which is required to produce a visual sensation. That is actually the measurement of your dark adaptation. Whenever you are going in a dark conditions from the lighted conditions, there is some time which we are taking to adapt ourselves. Okay, so that becomes your dark adaptation time, and that process is called as dark adaptation. How much you require the amount of luminance that is required to produce the visual sensation. Now this is your absolute intensity threshold. So after a certain luminance, and what is that? It is 0.03. The cones are responsible for the photopic vision. So there is actually a demarcation line of luminance below which that will be considered as a dim light, and that will correspond to the rods, and after that it will be the photopic vision, and the duty will be taken up by the cones. Now as the person enters a dark environment, what is happening? The light sensitivity of the retina increases while rod activity replaces that of the cones. That is your scotopic vision. So I have a photopic vision, I have a scotopic vision. So as soon as the person will enter the dark conditions, the rods will get up because they know now it's our turn, and they will be progressively replacing the duty of the cones. Both the photoreceptors, they are working together at the mid range of the illumination. So when it is completely dark, it is the rods. When it is completely bright, it is the cones, and in the mid of the illumination, it is both together. That is your mesopic range. When the rods function alone, obviously the colored objects will appear colorless, and only the cones, as you know that only the cones can perceive the color. Dark adaptation is plotted by an adaptometer. As the light sensitivity responds against a function of the time. So the dark adaptation can also be plotted, and the instrument that is used is an adaptometer, and there we are on one side I am plotting the light sensitivity, and another side I am plotting the time. And you will see that after 5 minutes of the light adaptation at 7:80, the subject is seated in the dark. So what you are doing, first I will give the illumination to the patient of 7:80, and then we are exposing this patient to the dark conditions. A test spot of increasing luminance is now presented until this becomes visible to the subject. So this the adaptation curve normally shows 2 successive phases. Okay, the adaptation of cones is represented by the sharp decrease in the light sensitivity threshold that stabilizes after a few minutes. Obviously, when the person is getting exposed to the dark conditions, the cones activity is being replaced by the rods. The sensitivity of the rod pathway is slowly and gradually improving after 5 to 10 minutes when the patient has already been exposed to the dark for about 5 to 10 minutes, and this will be your second part of the dark adaptation curve. So when I am plotting this dark adaptation curve as a function of the time, I will get 2 things. One is the decreased activity of the cones, and another is the increased activity of the rods, and the plateau is reached after around 20 minutes. This is utilized in the evaluation of retinal disorders, and this is the principle where what we are using in cases of ERG, the electroretinography. We are using this like for example when we are doing the recording of retinitis pigmentosa. So we are actually seeing, because in all those disorders where the rods and cones both are affected, in the retinitis pigmentosa also the rods and cones are affected, but rods are affected much more than the cones. So you can use this, we can see both the curves and how much is the disability. It is flat in the metabolic diseases, assessing the scotopic performance in the pilots and drivers. Even in the pilots and drivers where I require the good sensitivity of the rods and cones, cones, photoreceptors are at most required. There also I can use this one. There are individual differences in the rate of development of dark adaptation, the facility of the behavior under the low illumination. This is normal. Now again, an important thing is that I always tell you this in classes also, that dark adaptation time is not fixed for all. Like we all have a reaction time, everybody has his own dark adaptation time also, but beyond this, a certain level of differentiation and variability that will be considered under the normal range. Beyond that, it is variable and it can have certain differences, but the rate of the dark adaptation may be prolonged in the pathological conditions like retinitis pigmentosa, vitamin A deficiency and the glaucoma. So certainly you should know how to differentiate the normal variability from the abnormal variability. Then the next is your contrast sensitivity. Next is your contrast sensitivity. Now contrast sensitivity is a measure of the smallest distinguishable contrast, and indirectly it assesses the quality of the vision. So one is your quantity and another is the quality. So this contrast sensitivity is helping us to see how much is the smallest contrast at which you are able to appreciate that object, and it is indirectly therefore testing the quality of the vision. It is routinely tested. When we are testing the visual acuity, it is always said that it should be always taken under the good conditions of illumination, and it does not reflect the visual problems present when driving at night or on a cloudy day. So when the person is having a vision problem under the cloudy day or under the dim light conditions, there actually contrast sensitivity becomes important. If you remember, we deal this in neuro-ophthalmology, that there are certain senses that you are using for the visual perception. So there we have a light sense, we have a color sense, we have a contrast sense, and then we have got the form sense. And what forms the basis of the Snellen's chart? It was the form sense. Okay, so if a person has a low contrast sensitivity but he has a good form sense, he will be able to read 6 by 6. So that will not allow you to go up to that part. So this contrast sensitivity actually can be assessed by the letter contrast sensitivity or the use of the contrast sensitivity grating. So we have got different charts for this contrast sensitivity. Letter contrast sensitivity is measured using the visual acuity charts, but the contrast reduced from 50% to 4% of the normal. So we have got a very good chart there, which is actually the Pillai, Robson and Regan charts. These are most commonly used. Okay, you should be able to identify them. You should know the names that these charts are used for the contrast sensitivity. We have got the Pillai-Robson chart and we have got the Regan chart. Now they measure the contrast threshold of the letters of a certain size, and these letters show a gradual decrease of the contrast down the chart. So in the first line there is maximum contrast and then it will go on decreasing and decreasing. The charts are placed at 1 meter from the patient. Now again, this is important. It is not 6 meters. Okay, this is 1 meter from the patient, and patient is asked to read the smallest letter which is possible. Okay, so this is your Pillai-Robson chart. Okay, so this could be given in the exam and you could be asked that what it is used for, or what is the name of the chart, or what is the distance of the patient from this chart, something like this. Okay, so this is there. Now can you see we have got certain curves here. So these are your sinusoidal pattern gratings. Sinusoidal pattern gratings, they are used in the form of bars. They can be shown to the patient who has to identify the direction of tilt of each series of the bars. Okay, this we can use something like this. So we can use these kind of bars also to the patient. Okay, so what they are saying, that they get progressively smaller and smaller. Okay, and side by side we have got these sinusoidal curves also. Can you see this? So side by side we have got these sinusoidal gratings also, and then we can have a square grating. See, this one is your square gratings. Can you see the square pattern is forming? This is your square gratings. We can also use that one together with the diagrammatic representation. So of all the gratings, the two main variables are the degree of blackness to the whiteness, the contrast, and the distance between the repeats of the pattern. So the most important things that you have to analyze here is what is the degree of blackness to the whiteness, then second, what is the contrast, and the distance between the repeats of the pattern. So if I am having this repeat of a pattern, then what is actually the distance between the repeats? Okay, the distance between the repeat varies in terms of the retinal image as the observer moves towards or away from the page. It is usually therefore specified in terms of visual angle. Visual angle here will be the number of grating periods or the cycles per degree of the visual angle. So because you know this may vary depending upon what is the distance of the patient from this page, whether he is very near or very far. So you have to see the number of visual angles. Diagrams on the right side of the figure shows the output of an ideal reflection in the microdensitometer as it traverses the grating on the left in the horizontal direction. Okay, so this we have seen already. Now there is another one. This is your Cambridge contrast grating sensitivity. This requires the subject to identify the gratings on a blank card. Here we are using a blank card. Gratings of decreasing contrast are presented until the observer cannot distinguish the grating from the blank page. So I think the figure is not there, or what, 8.9, yeah. So this is there, okay, can you see? This is there. So we have got a blank page and we are using the different contrast sensitivity of lines here. So you have to see that up to which line the person can differentiate and which will become non-visible, invisible to the patient. So this can be used, okay. So we can use this Cambridge contrast sensitivity pattern also. Now assessment of the contrast sensitivity is indicated for the patients who have visual problems despite a normal visual acuity. Now one good important question is that this is how we check the contrast sensitivity, but another question is why we are testing the contrast sensitivity in whom what type of patients actually we are going to test it. So they are giving you a simple answer that the assessment is indicated for those patients who have a visual problem despite a normal visual acuity. They keep on saying that there is something abnormal, they are not able to see everything, they are not feeling that satisfaction, but the visual acuity is normal. Then it comes to your contrast sensitivity. It is affected in early cataract and after the refractive surgery also, again important things. And a very important thing is that it is a measure of the optic nerve disease, and it is changing in optic neuritis, multiple sclerosis, papilledema and glaucoma. So whenever we are talking about the diseases of the optic nerve, there also your contrast sensitivity becomes important. Alright, the next is your color vision, again a favorite of so many examiners, and multiple times we have faced one or more question on the color vision. So let's talk about the color vision. Testing color vision, actually most of the times it requires some elaborate apparatus, and there are two objectives in testing for the color blindness. What is the exact nature of the defect and whether the subject is likely to be a source of danger to the community. See, when we are testing the visual acuity, it is only affecting that person, okay, his economic loss or social loss, whatever. But if the person is having color blindness, the kind of profession he is choosing, that can become a serious threat even to the community. What if he becomes a pilot, a driver, laboratory technician, traffic police, something like this? So you have to be very, very careful. The first is an exhaustive investigation involving the stringent test with a pure spectrum. So if I want to find out what is the exact nature, I have to do a lot of investigations there. In testing for danger, it is obvious that the names given to the colors are of value. If a patient repeatedly calls red, green, or vice versa, he is unsuited to be an engine driver, a lookout man on a ship. So if he is not able to differentiate between the basic colors, what are the three primary colors? We were having the red, then we have the green, and then we have the blue. Yes. So if the person is not able to differentiate between these three primary colors and especially the red and green, so that becomes a threat. So let us see what are the different tests that we are doing. Okay, you already know the names. We have got a lantern test. The subject names various colors shown by the lantern, and you have to judge it by the mistakes he is making. Much here depends upon the size of the apertures of the lantern, okay, because you know what is happening, the size which is given, that area of aperture, that is signifying what area of the retina is being illuminated. And usually we are using the Aldrich green lantern test, okay. Then the second one is the Farnsworth Munsell 100 hue test. Now another important thing is that it is 100 hue test, but it is actually not using the 100 plates. It has got just the 85 plates, okay. It identifies the hue discrimination by an error score. The greater the score, the poorer the color vision. So those patients who are having the toxic optic neuropathy, they will be having a characteristic pattern on this Munsell 100 hue test. Then we have got certain isochromatic charts, like we have got the Ishihara's chart also. So these consist of the colored lithographic plates, and there are bold numerals which are actually printed over them in the dots, etc. And okay, normal trichromats can easily read the numbers, some of which cannot be distinguished by the various kind of people who are having some color vision defects. Like what they are using the primary colors. Suppose they are using the green background, and over that they have written the number with the red. So if a person has a red and green defect, if he cannot distinguish between the two colors, obviously he would not be able to read that color. That is the simple fundamental of these charts. The tests are also included in which the numbers can be read by the color defective persons but not by the normal sighted. And there are certain kind of things where the normal one will not be able to read, but the defective persons will read it. Then we have the Stilling's original test have now been largely replaced by the Japanese test of Ishihara's, which largely identify the red and green anomalies. Then we have got another test called as the Hardy-Rand-Rittler test, okay, that is also isochromatic chart, and it identifies the blue-yellow anomalies. So they can ask you that what are the names of isochromatic charts, what are their principles, okay, what are the defects they are detecting. Like Ishihara's one is actually detecting the red and green, while the Hardy-Rand-Rittler is mainly for your blue and yellow. Then we also have your anomaloscopes. Anomaloscopes, these are the instruments in which, on looking down a telescope, a bright disc is seen. So a person will be looking through that telescope, and the patient will be seeing a bright disc divided into two halves by a horizontal line. So if I talk particularly about the Nagel anomaloscope, one half is illuminated by the light of the sodium line of the spectrum, so that is yellow, and this has to be measured by a mixture of red and green. Red is your lithium line, okay, green is your thallium in the other half. By turning the knobs, relative amounts of red and green in the mixture and the brightness can also be varied. Then we have got another anomaloscope. This is your Pickford-Nicholson anomaloscope. This is for your blue-yellow. So what you can do, you can remember the name of the anomaloscopes. We have the Nagel's anomaloscope and the Pickford-Nicholson this anomaloscope, and you can remember that your Nagel's anomaloscope is for your red, green, yellow, and your other one is for blue and yellow, okay. You can remember this and look at these figures. They are ultra to the power 100 important, okay. So we have got the Ishihara color plates. Everybody knows this is your Ishihara color plates, okay. And then we have got the Nagel's anomaloscope, okay. Now sometimes what happens, you know it by the name, that Nagel's anomaloscope is actually used for the testing of the color vision, but you cannot identify it by seeing. So pictures have again become important, okay. Then is your the lantern test. Can you see the apertures here, the lantern test, and this is your 100 hue test, that is your Farnsworth Munsell 100 hue test. So okay, all these pictures are covered in our app also, okay. Defects of the color vision may be detected, but no single test is infallible. So mostly we have to use one or more of the test. Now we come to the binocular vision and the stereo acuity. binocular vision and the stereo acuity. In majority of the cases, examination of the visual acuity with both eyes open shows a distinct improvement in clarity. Now we know that when we are doing the examination of the visual acuity, we are testing the visual acuity, and if both eyes are open, there is lot of improvement that we are getting, because now I am giving the support of binocular vision to my eyes. So obviously that is why whenever I want to get out some of the defect, I don't allow both of the eyes to be opened. Okay, so this occurs because of a cortical summation of the visual input from the two eyes. So you know that there is a facility that is available in the visual cortex, that if both the eyes are seeing the similar objects, then there is fusion and you see the stereoptic vision, that is your depth perception. Now the testing of binocularity goes beyond the testing of acuity alone. Various devices, we have syneptophores, Begolini striated glasses, we have polarized projectors, and the binocular visual fields, which are tested with different colored glasses in front of the two eyes. They are used for the functioning. So again, you know what are the tests of binocular vision. If you remember, we have got syneptophores, Begolini striated glasses, we have got the projectors. Okay, all these things are used. Test to further quantify the extent. Then we have got the extent of stereopsis, which can actually measure your stereo acuity. So that instrument which is actually giving you a measure of stereopsis, that is called as the stereo acuity. That includes the various names, means of the dissociating the images presented to the right. They are actually having the means where we can dissociate the images presented to the right eye and the left eye by using the different colored glasses. These are called as the polarized lenses and appropriately designed pictures. Like we have the Titmus flight test, the TNO test, and the Rendot stereo acuity test. Again important, if you remember, I told you in the classes also that this Titmus flight test, this was asked as an image based question in AIIMS. So it has been seen over the times that these images which are covered here, they are all asked, and therefore I utterly cover them. Okay. Now see this, we have got different kind of test here. Can you see this one? What is this? Can you see the striations? These very thin striations. So this is your Begolini striated glasses test. Begolini striated glasses test. Okay, where these striations are there which are splitting, dissociating the two images. So one is giving you at an angle of 45 degree, and one is giving you at an angle of 135 degree. So basically they are perpendicular to each other, and when both the eyes are working, actually you see a cross, something like this we are able to see therefore. Okay, so you are able to see this. So if both eyes are working, you are able to see, and their fusion is there, then you are able to see. Then you have got something like this. This is your the Titmus flight test. This is your Titmus flight test, and here the test is actually done with the help of these glasses. These are your polarized glasses, and whenever you are testing them, the patient has to wear this. This is important. It is in the form of a booklet. We have got the right side and we have got the left side. Right side has got a housefly. Can you see? This is a housefly, and the left side has got two parts. Okay, actually it is getting blurred when I am zooming it. Then the upper part, we have got the rhomboids, which consists of the circles, and the lower part, this part consists of the animals. This part consists of the animals, and this part consists of the circles in the rhomboid. Then we have got the TNO test. Okay, we have got the TNO test. This one is your TNO test. Okay, this is your TNO test. And then we have got random acuity test and random dot acuity test. So remember the names and look at the pictures also. Now, stereo acuity is a measure of the ability of the eye to detect the horizontal disparity and is normal about 40 to 60 seconds of an arc. So, first of all, try to understand what is the stereo acuity. Stereo acuity means when you are able to measure the horizontal disparity. The two things are separate together. Like on the right side of the Titmus fly test, you put the housefly and you ask the person to hold the wings. So, obviously, if the person has that, stereopsis, he will hold the wings above. Suppose this is the chart, he will hold the wings above it because he has that 3D perception, but if he does not have, then he will be holding that chart only. So that is the difference. And what is the minimum value? The minimum value is about 40 to 60 seconds of the arc. It is abnormal in any condition with impaired vision if the visual acuity is less than 6/18. So what they are saying, they are clearly giving you a value that if the visual acuity is less than 6/18, can you see, if the visual acuity is less than 6/18, then the stereo acuity will be defective. Impaired binocular vision could be there, like if I am having an impaired binocular vision in my patient due to the strabismus, or there can be suppression or like acute optic neuritis. Okay, so in all these things, the stereo acuity will be affected. So you can also get all except MCQ. So wherever you are having very less of visual acuity, or you are having a problem with the binocular vision, one of the eyes is suppressed, you are having optic nerve problems, all the times you have the problem with the stereo acuity. This occurs because of the disturbance in the optic nerve conduction in cases of optic neuritis. All right. Now we come to the examination of the anterior segment. Examination of the anterior segment actually, requires a lot of techniques. General inspection of the eye is performed with the diffuse light of a torch or ophthalmoscope to acquire gross picture of the eye. And see, whenever you start with the examination, it has to be very, very precise. First we do the examination of anterior segment and then we do the posterior segment. Now when we do the examination of the anterior segment, you will have to start with the diffuse light. Now this diffuse light could be your torch light, or it could be your light of the direct ophthalmoscope. Sometimes when we do not have torches, we can use it, but be sure that you are dimming the battery of your direct ophthalmoscope, because fully charged, direct ophthalmoscope will give you a very strong light and patient will feel photophobia, and if he becomes photophobic in the initial phases only, obviously you cannot expect the cooperation till the last. Okay, so let's see what are the areas of abnormality that you are going to get. So always when you start with the examination, start the diffuse examination, you have to actually start from the eyebrows itself. Okay, don't think that if I have to test the anterior segment, you have to directly look at the cornea. Okay, this all will also be examined there, because even the lacerations and abrasions of the lids are also being sutured by us also. So start with the eyebrows. Okay, look at the upper lid, look at the lower lid, look at the eyelashes. There are so many abnormalities. Look at the eyelid margins also. We can have trichiasis, we can have poliosis, we can have metarosis, we can have entropions, we can have ectropions, we can have chalazions, the lid tumors, we can have styes, we can have nevus, we can have distichiasis, there are tylosis, there are so many things. So you are not able to see anything does not mean that you will not comment upon it. Now this is again important, even when you are going for the vivas and you are presenting any case in your OPD postings there. Okay, and you are telling about the examination, you will have to mention the negative history that there is no abnormality seen, or you will say that this all looking within the normal limits, depending upon your consultant, whatever he or she prefers. You will talk about it, that this seems normal, eyebrows are normal, not showing any abnormality, there is no evidence of any lid thickening or signs of infection, the signs of inflammation or trachoma or loss of eyelashes or inward turning of lid margin, something like this, or any enema in this course, you will have to tell. So after you have moved here, then only you move to the inner areas, and then you have to again go in the proper sequence, look at the conjunctiva. So when you look at the conjunctiva, okay, you will have to pull this lower lid, something like this, and you will get this area seen, and you will see the palpebral conjunctiva. You know that there are three parts of the conjunctiva. We have palpebral conjunctiva, we have bulbar conjunctiva, and we have conjunctival fornix. So you will have to look at the palpebral conjunctiva, then you will have to see the bulbar also. For the bulbar conjunctiva, it's always better that you ask the patient to look downward, and you do it something like this. So when the patient is looking down, okay, and you are pulling the eyelid, then you are easily able to see that bulbar conjunctiva, okay. And now you may have to see that upper eyelid also after everting, but that is not advisable to do it in the start, because again that requires a cooperation, and after doing that maybe the patient becomes uncooperative, so we will leave it for the last, okay. So look at the fornix, the conjunctiva, okay, any symbliphron, ankyloblephron, any congestion, you know, any circumcorneal congestion, the diffuse congestion, any evidence of discharge, or if you are getting, you know, matting of the eyelashes due to the acute mucopurulent conjunctivitis, anything could be there. Okay, so any, you know, thickening over the limbal area, like we have got the gelatinous thickening of the limbus in cases of vernal keratoconjunctivitis, or if you are able to see any ballooning of the conjunctiva, that is your chemosis. We can have conjunctival edema, and we can also have what you called as Horner-Twenter spots could be there, or we can have the Herbert this pits that will be seen over the conjunctiva, this below the limbus, just below the limbus. So all these things have to be matched, okay. See this, and you should also see the normal anatomy, okay. Then look at the cornea, it should be transparent. Look at the size of the pupil, then look at the shape of the pupil. So, look for any extra number of the pupils you have, okay. Then you have to see if there is any opacity or any degeneration, anything that you are getting over the cornea, any evidence of abrasion or ulcer, or any degeneration, or any band-shaped keratopathy, any, you know, growth you are seeing, any pingicula, any pterygium, okay. We can have white dot spots. So you know, the eyes only see what the mind knows. So here it is a time when you are applying your knowledge, whatever you know, you are seeing whether it's there or not. And then you can check the pupillary reactions also, okay. Then we can do, you know, this over the middle area, you can look at the lacrimal area if we have any signs of inflammation here for the Decorous cystitis. We can even do that regurgitation test, pressing over the middle side here, and see if there is any regurgitation test positive there. And if it is positive, then you have to go for the other sequence of the test there, syringing and probing and all that, okay. And after you have done all this, okay, no touch wala, when you have done, then you can ask the patient to give consent for that double lid eversion. And for that double lid eversion, suppose this is the lid, okay, then we are using like we can use the earbuds and anything, okay. And you have to press it, and you have to keep it like this, and over it you can evert this eyelids, something like this. So you are able to see this area. This is your palpebral conjunctiva. You have to look for the papillae, any papillary hyperplasia, any concretions, any follicles. All these things have to be taken care of. So this is again important, okay. Now the focal illumination or the oblique illumination. Now when you are moving towards your focal illumination or the oblique illumination, that could be used by a binocular loop, okay, or an electric torch. You can use the beam of which can be focused on a point and could be converted into a slit, and we can use our the Westman slit lamps also, okay. Now with a binocular loop, light is focused in the area of interest and a stereoscopic effect is obtained so that the depth of opacities can be determined. See, when you are doing the diffuse illumination, you are able to see the opacity, but when I want to know that up to which layer, we know that we have got 6 layers of the cornea. So if I want to know that up to which layer it is going, I require that oblique illumination, okay. So the degree of magnification is 3 or 4-fold in cases of the loops. Now the better ones are our slit lamp, that is more sophisticated instrument, and that is actually, I think, the very basic tool for your eye examination. It employs the same principles of the focal illumination. A brilliant bright light is brought to the focus as a slit by an optical system, and observations have to be made. And I have already made one separate video over the slit lamp examination. So if you are interested, you can go through that. What are the different details of slit lamp examination, we have covered there also. The magnification can be varied by changing the power of the eyepieces and the objective lenses. So there I have got two type of lenses. One is your eyepieces that we are focusing on, and then we have got the objective lenses. The slit lamp has a binocular viewing system that is co-pivotal with the illumination arm, allowing for the use of the various angles. The biomicroscope and illumination arms are parafocal and can be simultaneously focused at the same point at all the angles. So it's a very, very unique instrument, very sophisticated, and this is there. Okay, so what is happening here, on one side the patient has to sit, okay, and the other side is the examiner. And if you see here, this is the observer end, and here the patient will be sitting. This will be the chin rest, this will be the chin rest. So patient has to sit here and keep his chin over here, and this is your headrest. This is the headrest. So patient has to sit in such a way that chin is going into the bowl and this forehead is actually touching this headrest, so that he is not going behind. So you have to actually adjust the height of the sitting stool on which the patient is actually sitting in such a way that these 2 points are actually matched in the corresponding areas. And then we have got this one. This is your, you know, one you can say reference light, is that the eyes of the patient should be in level of this, so that you get to know that your positioning of the patient, especially for the beginners, that your position for the patient is all right. Okay, and this is for the hands. Okay, sometimes the patients does not know where to rest their hands, so they can rest their hands over this. Okay, this is can you see they have mounted the Goldman's applanation tonometer here. And this is your working knob. This is your working knob with the help of which we are doing the adjustments most of the times. And these are your eyepieces. These are your eyepieces, and this has to be maintained according to your IPDs, the observer's IPD. We have got these 2 different kind of knobs where you have to adjust. Okay. Then we have got, they have not shown you the lights. This is your off and on button is also there, and we have got different kinds of patterns and different kinds of models. So there are slight degree of variation could be there, but basic is this one. Okay. So I think this was a very good one. Yeah, we did discussed about the dark adaptation, the contrast sensitivity, and the general examination of the eye. So I'm not saying that you should know whole of the slit lamp, but these are the very basic things that you can see. And you know, when you know these basic things, you will get like interest also in going to the OPDs. When we do not know anything about it, that becomes boring. So you know how to adjust the eyepieces, what is this slit lamp, where the patient has to sit, you can help them in having that adjustment, and these are the basic questions that could be asked from you people. So, and we always talk about the Goldman's applanation tonometer. This has to be mounted over the slit lamp. Okay, what are the things that you have to see, what are the things that you have to actually rule out while doing the examination, what are the different types of examination. So I hope this will definitely help you in combating your clinical questions in your upcoming NEET PG. So tell me in the comment section, how did you like the video? Do like the video, and do share the video with all those people whom you think that they'll be benefiting from this video. Thank you, and happy ophthalmology.